Imagine Alabama in the summer of 1866. The war is over on paper. The chains are gone in law. A few miles outside Selma, the old Pine Hollow place sits half broken, half alive. Big house with missing shutters, fields gone ragged, rows of cabins leaning into the red dust. The Cartwright name is still on the deed. The people who once were counted as their property now sign their names, or mark an X, on contracts that smell like freedom and debt at the same time. Behind one of those cabins, in the hard-packed yard, a little black girl is skipping in the heat. Her name, in the surviving scraps of paper, is Lena May. In the ledger of the Freedmen's Bureau, beside her mother's name, someone wrote, "Age about 8." Anyone looking at her that afternoon would have said 4, maybe 5 at most. Her legs are thin as switch cane, bare feet kicking up dust as she hops over a bit of rope. A cracked gourd rolls at her heel. She laughs, high and bright, the sound of a child who has not seen the inside of a counting room or a courtroom yet. Her mother, Ruth, stands by the doorway with a dented bucket of water, sweat darkening the cloth around her neck. She should be thinking about supper, about the next day's work, about whether the new contract really means they can leave if they want. Instead, her gaze keeps sliding to the wall of the cabin, where the late sun paints everything in long, dark shapes. At first it looks ordinary, the outline of the porch post, the slant of the roof, the jagged edge of a stump. Then she sees Lena's shadow. The child is jumping, knees up, arms wide. On the wall beside her, her shadow isn't jumping. It leans. The shoulders round forward, the back curved the way Ruth has seen on women who picked cotton 40 years straight. One arm hangs, as if it's resting on a stick that isn't there. The bucket tilts in Ruth's hand. Water spills onto the dust, turning it to a dark patch of mud at her feet. "Lena," she calls, but her voice comes out too soft. The girl spins, rope tangling around her ankle, laughing. On the wall, the hunched figure does not spin. It turns its head slowly, as though the neck is stiff, as though it has carried too many seasons on those bones. Later, in a neat script on government paper, some lieutenant will write, "Colored child of about 8 worse, unusually small. Mother complains of shadow trouble." He will not write what that trouble looked like. Ruth cannot stop staring. Every other child in the yard throws a child's outline. Round head, short arms, straight little bodies. Only her daughter's darkness on the plank boards looks as if it has already buried friends, already buried husbands, already stood too many times at the far edge of a field and watched someone not come back. An old man named Josiah sits on an overturned crate, working a bit of twine with his fingers. He follows Ruth's eyes to the wall. His own face, already folded with age, goes tighter. "Don't stare, Ruth," he mutters, almost without moving his lips. "I seen that bend in a back. Last place I seen it was up on the hill, by the stones." She swallows. "It's just the sun," she answers, more to herself than to him. She just... Little. Little bones, he says. Big years. He looks away, as if refusing to give the shadow the courtesy of his full attention. Other women notice, even if they pretend not to. One drags her boy by the arm, pulling him out of the line of light. "Go play t'other side," she snaps. "Not against that wall." "Why?" he protests. But she cuts him off with a quick brush of her fingers across his forehead, a gesture that is not exactly a cross, and not exactly anything a white preacher ever taught. Another, under her breath, tells Ruth, "Don't let that child play where folk can watch. You keep her close to the doorway, where dark mixes with dark." Ruth bristles. "She ain't no thief of nothing," she says. But when Lena skips nearer, she reaches out and catches her around the waist, holding her too tightly, as if the girl might suddenly slide right out of her hands and into that crooked patch on the wall. Lena only feels the grip, not the reason. She squirms and laughs, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder. From where she is, the wall is just boards, the sun just light. She doesn't see that behind her. The shadow's head tilts in a way her own does not, as though the figure is listening for names called at a graveyard gate. Years later, in a faded transcript taken down by a New Deal worker with a tired typewriter, an old woman in Alabama will say, "My mama told me I was 8 when that man from the bureau came, but I looked no bigger than 4. Folks said my shadow was older than they were. I told them, I just stood where the sun put me." The typewriter captures the words. It cannot capture the way the others on the porch shifted their feet, not wanting to remember how that shadow looked against rough pine in the first summers after freedom. Back in 1866, the evening deepens. The insects start their harsh music. Someone calls the children in. Ruth turns to take Lena inside. For a breath, no one is moving in the yard. On the side of the cabin, in the last strip of gold, 2 shapes remain. One small, straight, the shadow of a thin little girl. Beside it, longer, bent at the waist, the outline of someone who has already carried a lifetime. When the light finally slides away, it erases both at once. Only the memory of what Ruth saw stays, pressing on her chest heavier than the bucket she dropped. And somewhere, in a notebook on a desk in Selma, an unfinished line waits beneath the words, "Not growing right," as if even the man with the pen was not sure how to write down what a shadow can hold. If you trace that line in the Selma notebook backward, past "not growing right," it leads to a night before the war, when nobody in Dallas County spoke of freedom as anything but a rumor. The same land, the same rows of cotton, but the cabins were fuller and the fear more organized. It is late summer of 1858 on Pine Hollow. The air in the slave quarters barely moves. Inside one narrow room, a tallow candle fights the dark. Ruth is 18, her belly hard as a gourd, sweat shining on her forehead though the window is open a crack. Outside, men come in from the fields, voices low, chains on tools clinking as they're put away. Inside, there is only Ruth's ragged breathing and the rustle of cloth. Old Millie sits at the foot of the pallet, bones wrapped in worn shawl, hands steady. For decades, she has been the one they send for when babies come or go too soon. She knows the rhythm of women's bodies better than any white doctor, who rides up once a year and leaves before sunset. "Hold on, girl," she murmurs, wiping Ruth's face. "You bring this one all the way here. You don't let go now." Ruth thinks of the last child that never cried, the small weight they carried out before dawn so the whites would not see. Her fingers clutch the rough blanket. Outside, a step in the yard, a man's voice. Thomas Cartwright calling for his supper, asking after that new issue Ruth's carrying. Even without seeing him, she feels the ownership in his tone. He told her, months back, that if she made a strong baby, he might move her out of the row gang more often. Her body has been turned into a number in his book. The pain crests. Millie leans in, speaks something soft that is not English, something brought across the water and never written down. There is one last hard push, a wet slide, and then silence. No sharp cry, no outraged wail. Ruth's heart drops. Is she gone? The words are barely there. Millie does not answer at once. She lifts the infant, checks the cord, brings a wrinkled ear to the tiny chest. There it is, a vigorous, quick drum, stubborn as a hammer on iron. "She's here," Millie says. "Just quiet." She turns the baby so Ruth can see. Small, darker than Ruth expected, fists clenched tight. The child's mouth opens once, closes again around a breath that never becomes a scream. It should be a moment of relief. But Millie's gaze is no longer on the baby's face. The candle throws their outlines against the log wall, and the old woman's eyes have drifted there. Ruth follows the look. Her own shape lies where it should, a bent figure on the pallet. The infant's form ought to be a little knot of shadow at her side. Instead, on the boards, appears a slender, upright figure, the size of a toddler, shoulders sloped forward as if from a long day's toil. One arm hangs at an angle that doesn't match the limp limb on Ruth's breast. Ruth jerks, almost dropping the child. "What is that?" Millie's jaw tightens. For a heartbeat, she seems as if she might blow out the candle and pretend nothing is there. Then she reaches over, shields the flame with her palm, narrowing the light. "Sometimes," she says slowly, "a baby comes carrying more than its own days. Hush now. You hold her. You don't say nothing if white folks ask." Ruth feels a shiver run across her back that has nothing to do with the birth. The baby is warm against her, impossibly light. On the wall, the tall shadow dips its head, exactly the way Ruth has seen old men bow when the overseer rides by. Weeks go by. The child is named Lena for a grandmother Ruth barely remembers, and May because Millie insists she needs a second name for when someone reads it to heaven. She nurses, sleeps, fusses, like any other infant. Only the quiet remains. Neighbors come to look. "She don't cry?" one woman whispers. "That ain't natural." "She breathes, don't she?" Millie snaps. "You want the Cartwrights hearing you call God's work wrong?" Ruth tries to focus on the ordinary, the washing, the hoeing, the quick stolen minutes with other girls at the well. But at night, when the candle is lit low, the wall never looks quite empty. One evening, months later, the quarters are thrown into mourning. Old Abel, who taught the younger men how to lay out rows straight and used to tell stories about Africa under his breath, does not wake up from his pallet. They bury him at the edge of the property, where the crooked stones lean. That night, Ruth sits with Lena in her lap, the baby no heavier than she was weeks earlier. The candle burns down. On the wall, the child's outline stretches. The spine in that shadow bends, just so, in the way Abel walked his last years, leaning on a cut cane. Ruth's throat tightens. "Abel," she whispers, hardly aware she has spoken. "You gone or you standing there?" Millie, sitting on a stool by the door, does not look up. "He ain't got land of his own to haunt," the old woman says, "so maybe he borrows a little place in our shade. Better that than nothing at all." A few days after, Thomas Cartwright steps into the doorway without knocking. He smells of sweat and whiskey. Ruth snatches Lena closer. "So that's the new one," he says, looking down. "Scrawny. We'll see if she earns her keep. I don't feed mouths that won't grow." He never glances at the wall. The afternoon light has shifted. The shadow there is small, curled like any baby's, as if something has flattened itself to escape notice. When he leaves, boots thudding along the packed earth, Millie lets out a breath Ruth didn't realize she was holding. "You listen to me," the old woman says. Low. "You don't point at her shadow. You don't tell them what you see. Some things belong to us, not to their books." That night, Lena wriggles off the pallet and begins to drag herself along the floor, hands and knees finding the grooves between the boards. Ruth watches, half proud, half uneasy. The candle flickers. On the planks, the dark shape that follows her is longer than her body by half. It seems to hesitate at the threshold, as if an older pair of feet is testing whether to cross. By the time cannon sounded in distant states, and men on the road talked about a tall lawyer in Washington, the cabins at Pine Hollow still woke to the same bell. 1861 came with rumors of war, but the rows of cotton had not heard the news. Children grew. That was the first calendar Ruth trusted. Boys who once crawled in the dust now chased one another along the packed path, legs long, voices rougher. Little girls who shared scraps of cloth with Lena stretched out into narrow-hipped runners, braids swinging, teeth already showing gaps from new growth. Lena stayed slight. At 5 by the ledger, she fit into dresses sewn for toddlers. Millie let out seams, then stitched them back again the next year with almost no change in length. When the other mothers compared hand-me-downs, there was always a pause around Ruth. "She's still in that same frock?" one of them murmured, half pity, half unease. "She eats," Ruth answered, defensive. "She keeps food down. She just don't take up more space." No one said aloud what they all counted in their heads. Time was moving, and her bones refused to follow. On a Sunday evening, when work ended early, the children gathered in the yard. Someone scratched a circle in the dirt, and they hopped in and out, chanting a little rhyme. Sun lay low, flattening their shapes across the ground. From the doorway, Ruth watched as each shadow flung itself long and thin, all gangly limbs and bobbing heads. All but one. Where Lena jumped, a compact body left the dust, yet the darkness beside the circle slumped forward, shoulders rounded as if carrying a load across miles. The neck in that outline tilted just so, an angle Ruth knew from old Dinah, who had been buried 3 days before. Ruth's hand rose to her own collarbone. "You seeing that?" she whispered. A man leaning against the cabin wall didn't look directly. His gaze slid past the children to the patch of earth under the big sycamore. "I seen that crook in a neck," he said quietly, "when we laid her down." Word crept through the quarters like smoke. After each burial, eyes went not only to the fresh mound at the edge of the property, but to whatever surface held Lena's shade that night. When a man with a twisted foot died of fever, someone noticed that for a week, Lena's dark double seemed to favor one leg, even while she stood square. "She carrying what's left of us," an old woman said, not unkindly. "Pieces we didn't get to use." Others shook their heads. "Don't talk that way. You'll bring her trouble from the big house." For Lena, the pattern came as sensation before anyone named it. Each time a soul left, she found breathing harder, limbs heavy as if she had walked all day, though she'd barely left the stoop. She would lie awake, heart pounding too fast, staring at the wavering forms on the wall. "Ma," she whispered once, child voice thin. "Why do I feel tired when I ain't done nothing?" Ruth smoothed her hair, searching for words that would not break them both. "Some folks rest in the ground. Maybe some rest in what lies beside you. You sleep now." War rolled closer. Wagons passed with men in gray, drums thudding somewhere beyond the trees. One Cartwright son rode off with a flag. The rest stayed to guard what they called their property. Overseers grew meaner, anxious about missing hands. One dusky evening, trouble flared in the yard. Isaiah, barely grown, got accused of hiding cotton. The new white man who watched the weights, Dunning, snatched a strap from a nail and dragged the boy toward a post. Neighbors drifted from doorways, pulled as surely as if a bell had rung. Ruth, with Lena at her side, blended into the ring of faces. "Go inside," Ruth murmured, tugging at her daughter's arm. "I want to see," Lena said, not out of cruelty, but because every sharp moment in that place pulled her like a magnet. Her bare feet dug into the dirt. The sun had slipped, leaving a wash of amber along the cabins, long bands of shadow running toward the post. Dunning raised his arm. In that instant, something shifted underfoot. To those who later swore by it, the darkness on the ground moved first. Between the overseer and his target, A shape thickened. Not quite the boy's own shade. Not quite Lena's slight outline, but a layered figure. One small form, and over it the dim echo of a bent elder, shoulders blocking the space where the strap would descend. Dunning hesitated. He would tell himself later that his wrist cramped, or the light bothered his eyes. For a heartbeat, though, his gaze locked on the patch of earth between his boots and Isaiah's. "What are you waiting on?" Eleanor Cartwright called sharply from her porch. He cleared his throat, forced a laugh. "Nothing but these old bones." The strap lowered a fraction. Across the yard, Lena swayed. A pressure like the air before lightning pressed against her chest. She reached toward Isaiah without meaning to. As the leather fell, a few blows landed on his back, but not with the ferocity they first promised. After the third strike, Dunning cursed, tossed the strap aside. "Get him out of my sight," he muttered. That night, Isaiah came to the well where Ruth drew water. He touched his bruises, testing. "I saw it," he said quietly, eyes on Lena, who perched on the step. "Something stood where I ought to be. My skin took some of it, but not all. She looked tired now, don't she?" Lena hugged her knees, forehead pressed against bony arms. She felt as though she had run to Selma and back. On the wall beside her, the lamplight caught a hunched outline that did not quite match her small frame. "They gonna notice," Isaiah went on, "if your girl keeps standing between them and what they think they own." Ruth's stomach nodded. "We keep our heads down, that's all." He shook his head slowly. "They already starting to count us like rows. Sooner or later, someone with papers and questions comes looking. And he'll want to reckon even with a child whose days won't fit his page." The guns went quiet, but Pine Hollow did not feel free. The same dirt rows cut the fields. The same big house stared down from its rise. Only the names had changed. Hands instead of slaves. Contracts instead of bills of sale. Men in uniform now came with ink bottles instead of whips. One hot afternoon, a narrow wagon rolled in from Selma. On the side, someone had painted, in quick, official strokes, U.S. The young man who climbed down wore a faded blue coat and carried a leather case under his arm. Lieutenant Charles Merriweather, agent of the Freedmen's Bureau, introduced himself to Miss Eleanor Cartwright with a stiff bow and an apology for the dust. "I'm here to register labor agreements with your workers," he said, catching himself before the old words slipped out. The people from the cabins were called up one by one to the table set under a chinaberry tree. Their names, ages, kin, promised shares were scratched into government paper in a hand they could not read. When Ruth's turn came, she brought Lena with her. The girl hid behind her skirt, thin fingers bunched in the cloth. "How old is the child?" Merriweather asked, pen lifted. Ruth's mouth went dry. She knew the year Lena had entered the world because Millie had marked it with a notch on a beam. "8, sir." "Near enough." Merriweather glanced over the edge of the ledger. The girl reaching for her mother's hand looked no more than 4 or 5. Small wrists, narrow shoulders, the sort of size he had seen in sickly town children, not in those who worked rows. 8, he repeated slowly, writing the number. After a pause, he added in smaller script, almost an aside to himself. Stature markedly below stated age. Locals mutter of some shadow matter. He did not ask what that phrase meant. Time was short, the line of people long, and superstition was not his department. Still, as Ruth turned away, he found his eye drawn to the ground. For a moment he thought he saw a second outline beside Lena's, a bent smear of darkness that did not match her movements. Then the wind stirred grit across the yard, and the image broke. Weeks later, sickness in the big house brought another visitor from town. Dr. Amos Whitfield arrived with his bag of instruments to tend to a Cartwright cousin. When he had finished dosing the patient with bitter tonic, Eleanor detained him at the door. "While you're here," she said, "there is that tiny girl the Negroes whisper about. They frighten one another with tales. It would be helpful if you could pronounce her sound." Ruth did not have the power to refuse. She stood Lena in the cleared space between two pallets, while Whitfield measured and listened, muttering numbers under his breath. "She eats well?" he asked. "When there is food," Ruth answered. "No cough, no fits, only bad dreams." He pressed fingers to the child's arm, felt the thrum beneath skin. "She is undersized, nothing more. Many in her condition fail to thrive after fever or hunger. The rest," he flicked a hand, referring to the talk he had already heard, "is the fruit of frightened minds." During the examination, the light slanting in through the cabin door threw a mild, ordinary silhouette at Lena's feet. She stood obediently, hands at her sides, and the shadow seemed a simple smudge. Yet as Whitfield stooped to repack his instruments, he glanced sideways and caught a disconcerting angle. As the girl shifted her weight, the dim figure on the floor appeared, for a heartbeat, to move a fraction later, like an older person struggling to rise. His scalp prickled. He straightened abruptly, annoyed at himself. "I find no physical deformity," he reported to Eleanor. "What you have is gossip, not a demon. Discipline your people, and these stories will fade." Discipline, in that season, often came dressed as salvation. The same autumn, a circuit-riding Methodist, Reverend Jonah Pike, began holding services in the old plantation chapel, now called a meeting house for the freed. The pews were rough, the windows patched, but Pike's collar was clean and his Bible well thumbed. On a humid evening, with lamps smoking in the corners, the room filled. Field hands in worn shirts, women in faded headscarves, children perched on benches or on the floor. Ruth took a place near the back, pulling Lena down beside her. Pike preached of order and obedience, of new laws and old sins. When he reached the verse about iniquity visited upon the children, his cadence rose. "There are those," he thundered, "who would rather cling to dark tales than walk in the clear light of the Lord." At that line, half a dozen heads turned not toward the pulpit, but toward the aisle where Lena sat. The lamps behind her threw the congregants' forms long across the planks. In that cramped space, shadows overlapped and bled into one another. Still, several women later swore that for an instant the patch beneath the girl did not look like a child at all, but like a small figure flanked by something older, shoulders bowed in a posture of endless kneeling. A whisper fluttered along the pews, then snapped shut when Pike's gaze swept the room. Afterward, on the steps outside, he spoke quietly with Eleanor and Whitfield. Meriwether, still in the county, lingered at the edge of their cluster, arms crossed. "They fix their fears on that girl," Pike said. "As long as they believe her different, they will gather round her instead of listening to proper authority." "Then we must put an end to it," Eleanor replied. "I will not have my place ruled by tales." Whitfield, tired and irritable, rubbed the bridge of his nose. The mind can be shown its errors. A simple demonstration, a lamp, a wall, the child in between. Let them see with their own eyes that there is nothing there but angles of light. Pike nodded slowly. "We can frame it as instruction. A little talk on God's world being orderly. Strip the fear away." Meriwether looked from one white face to the other, uneasy. "Be sure you do no harm," he said. "These people have had enough of being used to prove someone's point." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "We intend only to settle the matter." Under the dim emerging stars, the decision hung between them, a plan to bring Lena into the chapel again. Place her where every gaze could study the darkness at her back and insist the mystery be tamed. They chose a night when the air itself felt heavy. Word went quietly from cabin to cabin. Everyone was to come to the chapel after sundown. No one said why. They did not need to. Folks had heard enough of the talk under the chinaberry tree. Inside, the small building was close and dank. Lamp smoke clung to the rafters. Rough benches filled fast, men from the fields, women with babies bundled against their chests, children pressed between knees. At the front, a length of pale cloth had been stretched against the wall, white against the dark planks. On a table nearby waited a glass lamp, its chimney polished clear. Dr. Whitfield adjusted the wick with quick, precise fingers. Reverend Pike stood with his Bible open, lips already moving in a private prayer. Miss Eleanor sat rigid on the front pew, gloves in her lap. Old Millie slipped in late, leaning on her stick, and took a place near the door. Ruth guided Lena to the end of a bench and tried to fold her small body into her own shadow. Pike's voice rose first. He spoke about fear, about spirits of darkness that men invited when they clung to old tales. He did not name the girl, but every head knew where not to look. "Tonight," he said at last, "we will show you how the Lord's world is made. Nothing moves there but what He made to move. No tricks, no hidden power." Whitfield lit the lamp and set it behind the cleared space before the hanging cloth. The flame flared, then steadied, throwing a bright oval. He gestured. "Bring the child." Ruth's hands trembled as she nudged Lena forward. The girl's bare feet whispered over the boards. She stepped into the circle of light, back to the lamp, face to the crowd. Her outline leapt onto the cloth, small, narrow-shouldered, hair tied in a short, ragged knot. A murmur slid through the room. Whitfield spoke, in a measured tone, as he moved the lamp a little higher, a little lower. The silhouette lengthened, shrank, lay thin, grew stout, always tied to her. "You see?" he said. "Closer, smaller, farther, taller. Nothing more." For a few moments the explanation held. People leaned forward, tracking the shifting shape. Some nodded, half relieved, half ashamed of their own stories. Ruth gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles blanched. Then Pike began to pray aloud. "Lord, strip away deceits," he cried. "Scatter these false visions. Let no child be a vessel for error. Break every chain of fear." At his words, Lena flinched. Her shoulders drew in. She turned her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. On the cloth, the figure did not copy that shrinking. Its back seemed to round, not with a child's startle, but with the slow curvature of age. The neck bent forward. What had been a small, straight stick of an arm eased into a hook, the hand hanging as if it knew the feel of a cane. A low hiss went through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Millie," before clapping a palm over her own mouth. Whitfield, intent on his lecture, did not catch the first change. He only saw faces shifting, eyes widening. Irritated, he swung the lamp sideways to demonstrate again. The flame wobbled in the glass. The dark shape wavered, then steadied, no longer matching the slight posture of the girl before it. Lena's own body stood rigid, hands flat at her sides. On the cloth, the deeper shadow beside hers seemed to turn, just a fraction, toward the door. Old Millie had pushed herself up without realizing it. Stick tapping, she took 2 steps down the aisle. "Hush now," she said under her breath, words meant for the darkness more than the room. "You carried enough. Leave that child." She reached out, gnarled fingers brushing the cloth just where the bent shoulder lay. At that instant, the lamp, perched too close to the edge of the table, tipped. Maybe a board shifted, maybe someone's knee struck it in the crush. The glass fell, broke. Burning oil splashed against the lower corner of the hanging. Flame licked upward with a dry roar. People surged back, benches screeched. Someone screamed the word, "Fire," as if it were a curse. Children were snatched up, bodies shoved between pews toward the door. In the chaos, old Millie lost her footing. A younger man slammed into her from behind, not seeing her small frame. Her head struck the end of a bench with a dull, final sound. She crumpled beside Lena, who had dropped to her knees, arms thrown over her own skull. Men beat at the burning cloth with coats and hymnals. Smoke rolled low, tasting of oil and old dust. When the flames were at last smothered, the white sheet hung in blackened tatters. The marks of the silhouettes were gone. Later, they carried Millie back to the cabins. Her eyes opened once under the lantern's glow. She looked past Ruth, past the circle of worried faces, to the child sitting silent on the floor. "Don't let them cut you from what holds you," she whispered, or seemed to. Then her chest eased out a final breath and did not rise again. The next day, Whitfield called it a regrettable mishap. In his notebook, he wrote of accidental injury to aged Negro woman during demonstration to dispel unhealthy notions. Pike, in a letter to his superiors, blamed overwrought emotions and promised stricter order. Eleanor spoke only of that foolish display and ordered the topic dropped. Among the people in the cabins, no one believed it was folly alone. To them, it was the price of forcing something sacred into a lantern show. Ruth sat through the night with Lena tucked against her side, careful to sit where the wall remained in shadow. When dawn came, she watched the thin strip of light slide across the floor and stop just short of her child's feet. She did not move closer. In Selma, when Lateen Merriweather heard of the blaze and the death that followed, he added a few tight lines to a fresh report. Locals' attempt to address superstition around small colored girl resulted in one fatality: fear of further unregulated experiments. Recommend higher authority, consider oversight or removal of said child from present environment. He laid down his pen and stared at the words. Oversight. Removal. On the page, they looked clean. Out on Pine Hollow, they would mean something very different. They brought her to Selma in a wagon that rattled through the courthouse square, the horse's breath rising in white puffs against the morning heat. Inside, the tall room glowed with sunlight, pouring through the arched windows, pale dust twisting in every beam. Judge Horace Wilcox presided from his dais, black coat fastened high, eyes half-lidded. Papers rustled. A ceiling fan creaked without turning. Ruth stood by the door, face drawn tight under her headscarf. Lena's hand rested in hers, small, damp, the bones like bird legs. She wore the same faded dress she'd outgrown years ago without ever stretching its seams. Dr. Whitfield arranged his papers. Reverend Pike murmured into his collar. Miss Eleanor Cartwright watched with that calm, pinched look people wear when they believe they already know the truth. "Bring the child forward," said the judge. Lena walked to the center, each step tapping like a clock hand against the floor. Her shadow fell neat and ordinary at first, a slim streak under her feet. Whitfield spoke in his practiced, reasonable voice. "The child's condition is purely physical. Growth failure, nothing more. The rest is talk, the residue of primitive fear." The judge nodded. "We are here to ensure peace, not to argue with phantoms." Then he looked down. The outline on the planks had changed shape, just a breath of difference, but enough. The shoulders of the shadow hunched, one arm curved inward, fingers invisible but implied. The head drooped, an old person's posture drawn in darkness. The blackness stretched longer, its edge creeping toward the judge's boots. No one spoke. The girl stood still as carved wood. Yet a clerk's pen snapped. Someone whispered a prayer too low to catch. The air turned tight, metallic, as if the room itself held its breath. Reverend Pike found his voice first. The Lord's light plays tricks, Your Honor. Let us and give fear dominion." Wilcox blinked once, twice, then lifted the gavel. "The court finds no danger, no madness, no cause for removal. Record it and be done." The notes from that day fit inside half a page. Examined colored minor, Lena May. Small stature, sound mind. Community advised to refrain from superstitious gatherings. Outside, Ruth led her daughter back to the wagon. Behind them, the courthouse bell tolled noon. She did not look down to see if the shadow still walked true. That night in the cabins, no one repeated the verdict aloud. Mothers told their children not to stare when lamps burned. Men chewed their supper slower. The few who'd been in the courthouse sat silent, knowing what they'd seen could never be written cleanly in ink. Years passed, and Pine Hollow crumbled back into dust. In 1937, a WPA interviewer visited an old woman near Selma. She wrote in a slow, slanted hand. "There was a girl once, small like a doll. Her shadow carried the years we couldn't." The official transcript shrank it to one neat line. Informant recalls story of child with unusual shadow. Decades later, a medical student reading Selma's Historical Society journals underlined a note. Case of colored girl, dwarfism, local hysteria over aged shadow. No organic basis. In another box, a Freedmen's Bureau officer's report mentioned a chapel disturbance, one fatality. And among a bundle of wills, a clerk's private scrawl read, "I wish I had not looked at the floor that day." At a small black college, a teacher's notebook from 1894 held a single cryptic line between arithmetic drills. "Tell them how one child bore our worn-out years in the dark that followed her." By the late 20th century, a historian pieced these shards together under library light. Outside, traffic droned. Inside, her fingers trembled over photocopies of 3 centuries' worth of silence. The same outline surfaced again and again. A girl too small for her age, standing where the light fell wrong. She wrote in the margin, "Maybe the tale condensed many lives. Maybe it was the only way a people could speak about carrying more time and grief than one body could hold." And somewhere in Dallas County, an old woman tucked a child beneath a quilt. "Don't let what walks behind you grow old before you do," she whispered. The child laughed, hearing only a bedtime warning. The old woman smiled into the dark. Some truths survive by pretending to be stories. When the sun sinks low and your own outline stretches long, remember her, the girl who never grew, and the shadow that refused to die young.